Rain hammered the cracked asphalt to the downtown parking lot, a steady percussion masking the occasional roar of distant traffic. Walter Hayes, a black Army veteran with a salt and pepper beard and a weathered leather jacket, slid his car into a space outside the municipal office, the neon City Hall parking sign flickering above. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the gray drizzle for familiar faces. A routine visit, renew a contractor's license, should have been mundane. Instead, a black SUV cut sharply in front of him, tires hissing against puddles. Two uniformed officers emerged, their badges gleaming under the street lamps. One of them, white, tall, and broad-shouldered, approached Walter with a deliberate, slow menace. "Step out of the car," the officer barked. Walter's hands froze on the wheel. He had encountered prejudice before. He had fought through it in foreign deserts, survived it in office cubicles. But this was brazen, public, and sharp as a knife. He tried to explain, voice steady despite the tightening in his chest. The officer leaned closer, eyes cold. "You think rules don't apply to people like you?" Walter's mind raced. His badge of service meant nothing here. Around him, rainwater pooled to the officer's boots, reflecting fluorescent lights like fragments of judgment. The tension coiled tighter with every tick of the clock. A hand on his shoulder, a shove, the scrape of metal on concrete. Walter's breath hitched. In that instant, he realized this was no random act. Someone wielded power for personal judgment, untouchable, hidden behind the city's facade. He looked up, rain streaking his face, and caught a glint of something in the officer's eyes, a dangerous authority that would not be questioned. And then came the words, low, venomous, echoing in the drizzle, "You don't belong here." Walter's heartbeat spiked. One misstep, one word, could change everything, and the officer already held the city's weight behind him. Rain fell in sheets, turning the City Hall parking lot into a mirror of fluorescent lights and puddles. Walter Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan, the leather worn smooth from years of military service and long drives. His jacket, soaked through at the shoulders, clung to him. The drizzle muffled the distant hum of traffic, leaving only the rhythm of water tapping against the windshield. He had parked before, countless times, but today something felt different. The officer appeared suddenly, stepping from the shadows with a measured, deliberate gait. A tall, broad-shouldered white man with a crisp uniform and polished boots. "Step out of the car," he demanded. The words were sharp, clipped, like a whip cracking through the air. Walter's hands tightened on the wheel. "I'm here to renew a license," he said, voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "I'm not." "Step out," the officer barked again, leaning close. His badge reflected the streetlight in a sudden, almost blinding flash. The stance was one of ownership, of control. Bystanders' eyes flicked briefly, some curious, some uneasy, but no one intervened. Walter exhaled slowly, climbing out of the car with measured precision. Every step was deliberate. Military training had taught him discipline, composure under fire, but nothing could prepare him for this kind of brazen public intimidation. The officer circled him, scanning, assessing. "You think rules don't apply to people like you?" The words hit, blunt, unforgiving. Walter's mind catalogued the insult, catalogued the power imbalance, the casual impunity in which it was delivered. A hand pushed him lightly but firmly against the hood of the car. Rainwater splashed off the metal, soaking his gloves. He caught the officer's eyes and recognized something dangerous there, authority untouchable, hidden beneath layers of political influence. "You don't belong here," the officer said, voice low but venomous. Walter's heartbeat spiked. He could feel the stays of witnesses, the potential for escalation. His service, his integrity, his record, they all meant nothing in this moment. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, an indifferent spectator to injustice. Walter remained silent, calculating. He did not strike back. He did not yell. He held himself upright, absorbing the humiliation, storing it. Each breath was measured, each second stretched like a taut wire. The officer, sensing control, smirked, the faintest curl of satisfaction at Walter's restraint. A passerby muttered something under their breath, and the officer's attention flicked briefly, but that was enough for Walter to break free from the immediacy of the threat. He stepped back, wiped the rain from his face, and slid into the driver's seat, doors locking behind him. Engine hummed. Tires hissed over wet asphalt. Walter drove away, but the image of the officer's glare, the public shove, the words, every detail burned into his memory. He understood, in that moment, that this encounter was neither random nor isolated. It was a pattern, a demonstration of power enforced with impunity, and a warning. Challenge it, and consequences would follow. As the rain blurred the city lights, Walter's mind raced with possibilities. How could he respond? Where could he find leverage? The officer had underestimated one thing: Walter's patience, his strategy, and his refusal to be broken publicly. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The encounter had ended, but the threat remained, waiting, coiled and silent, as Walter realized just how far-reaching it truly was. Walter Hayes stepped into the municipal office, the familiar scent of polished wood and recycled air doing little to calm his nerves. The rain had stopped outside, but the gray drizzle left the street slick and reflective, mirroring the tension in his mind. He approached the front desk, greeted by the receptionist's polite but dismissive nod. "I need to file a formal complaint," Walter said, keeping his tone controlled, "about an officer who harassed me in the parking lot yesterday." The receptionist's pen paused midair. "We have procedures for that," she replied, flipping through a stack of forms. "You'll need to speak with Internal Affairs. That office is on the second floor." Walter nodded, collecting the required form. As he walked toward the elevator, he noticed the muted stares of other visitors, some sympathetic, some indifferent. He pressed a button, the metal doors closing with a soft ding. Inside, the walls were lined with framed certificates and photos of city officials shaking hands with community leaders. Every image seemed to mock him, a reminder of the system's performative civility. The IA office was quiet, officers typing behind frosted glass partitions. Walter explained the incident in detail, providing license plate numbers, times, and the officer's description. He handed over the security footage from the parking lot. The officer behind the desk barely glanced at the screen. "Procedures must be followed," she said, voice monotone. "We'll review the complaint." Meanwhile, the officer has the right to his own account of events. Investigations can take weeks, sometimes months, and discretion is afforded to our personnel. Walter's jaw tightened. So, public harassment is acceptable until it's formally proven otherwise. The officer shrugged. "It's not our place to judge intent. Only facts, documentation, and procedure." Walter realized the walls were not just physical. They were procedural, cultural, and systemic. Every phrase, every polite deflection, was a reinforcement of the officer's power. His military training screamed for action, but the bureaucracy demanded patience, a patience that felt like submission. Days passed. Emails went unanswered. Calls were redirected. Walter followed up, speaking to supervisors who parroted the same lines. "Procedure must be followed. Officer discretion. We take all complaints seriously." The words were hollow, repeating like a looped recording, designed to exhaust and frustrate anyone who dared challenge the system. At home, Walter reviewed every interaction. His laptop glowed with email threads, incident reports, and news articles about similar cases. Patterns emerged: formal language that denied agency, indirect threats couched as procedural caution, and the constant reminder that authority was untouchable without overwhelming proof. He discussed the situation with his sister, a lawyer. "You're bumping against more than one officer," she said. "You're challenging the system itself. They'll slow-roll, obfuscate, and hope you give up." Walter listened, absorbing the weight of truth. The system was a living barrier, a network designed to protect its own. The officer in the parking lot had more than rank. He had a shield built from policies, politics, and indifference. Walter could fight, but the battle would be measured in strategy, not impulse. He returned to the municipal office one final time that week, determined to speak to someone in authority who could move the complaint forward. A clerk, sympathetic yet powerless, whispered, "Be careful. People in that office don't like complaints against certain officers. You might provoke them more than you help yourself." Walter left without resolution. Outside, puddles reflected the overcast sky, as if the city itself bore witness to the inequities he faced. He realized that resistance required more than filing paperwork. It demanded knowledge, alliances, and patience, tools the officer likely assumed he did not possess. By the time he reached his car, the sun was fading, casting long shadows over the street. Walter sat behind the wheel, staring at the empty space where the officer had stood. The memory of the shove, the words, and the cold authority remained vivid. But he also recognized clarity. Understanding the system's mechanisms was a first step toward dismantling its unchecked power. The encounter in the parking lot had been a spark. The bureaucratic stonewalling, the drag of procedure, was fuel. Walter's mind worked through the avenues of leverage, media, legal allies, witnesses. Each step required careful calculation. The weight of systemic oppression pressed down, but it no longer paralyzed him. He started the engine, rainwater dripping from his jacket onto the console, and drove forward with purpose. The city had tried to bury the incident in its procedural indifference. Walter knew better. The fight had only just begun. Walter Hayes spent the following days piecing together fragments of information. Every conversation, every whispered tip, every background check became a thread in a larger tapestry he was determined to unravel. The municipal officer's cold walls had not beaten him. They had only clarified that brute patience would yield nothing. Strategy, not impulse, was now his instrument. He started with public records. The officer who had shoved him in the City Hall parking lot had a clean official record, no disciplinary actions, no complaints registered. The system had been careful, meticulous, protective, but there were anomalies, unusually fast promotions, frequent appearances at high-profile events, and, most tellingly, public security assignment at mayoral functions. Walter noted every date, every event, cross-referencing them with city press releases and social media posts. A former colleague of the officer, hesitant but cooperative, confirmed the suspicion. His close to the mayor, the source said, glancing nervously around. Personal security detail. Is untouchable in ways most officers aren't. You step to him, and it's not just an officer, you're challenging the mayor's inner circle. Walter's pulse quickened. The incident in the parking lot was no random display of authority. It was an assertion of untouchable power. The officer's confidence, the venom in his words, the way he had cornered Walter, all of it was amplified by political protection. He took the investigation further, talking to city employees and private security consultants. Patterns emerged. The officer had leverage, favors owed, discreet enforcement of political influence, and a reputation for bending rules to maintain loyalty. Walter mapped these connections, noting who in the city hierarchy would resist a complaint and who might secretly be sympathetic. The personal toll was immediate. Every call, every email, every cautious conversation required emotional armor. Walter's system monitored his stress, reminding him to record interactions, maintain meticulous notes, and avoid confrontation outside safe channels. The memory of the shove, the officer's words, "You don't belong here," haunted him. But now he understood the context. The officer's audacity was systemic, empowered by political proximity. Late one evening, Walter sat at his kitchen table, spread out spreadsheets and city directories before him. The rain tapped lightly on the windows, a distant echo of the day that had started this chain of events. His gaze fell on a photo of the mayor at a fundraising event. Beside him, almost unnoticed in the frame, was the officer, subtly positioned to observe and command. The realization hit. The officer had been a fixture in the mayor's orbit long before their encounter. His authority in the parking lot was an extension of political power, a test of boundaries, and a reminder that the system shielded him. Walter leaned back, processing the depth of what he had uncovered. The officer was not just a bully. He was an institutional instrument, wielded with precision. Challenging him required more than filing complaints. It demanded leverage, allies, and evidence that could pierce the protective layers of political immunity. He contacted a veteran journalist he trusted, someone experienced in uncovering hidden networks. "I have a story," Walter said, voice low, steady, about an officer with extraordinary access and authority, and an abuse of power that goes beyond one incident. The journalist's interest was immediate, pragmatic. Verification, corroboration, proof. Walter supplied what he had: dates, names, videos, witness statements. Every detail was a weapon in its own right. At the same time, Walter began speaking quietly to former colleagues from the military. Their networks extended into security, law enforcement, and media. He asked questions carefully, tested boundaries, ensured that each contact was discreet. The goal was clear: construct a web of knowledge and support that could withstand retaliation. The culmination of these efforts occurred one rainy afternoon, mirroring the day of the initial harassment. Walter received a tip. The officer had been involved in manipulating internal investigations before, protecting political allies, and silencing dissent quietly. The source, anonymous but credible, suggested that legal vulnerability existed, but it was buried under layers of bureaucracy and loyalty. Walter closed his laptop, rain streaking the window pane, and exhaled. The path forward was dangerous, but it was visible. He had uncovered the connection, the officer's hidden authority as the mayor's security chief. Now he could plan, strategize, and act. The confrontation in the parking lot had been personal. The battle ahead was structural. The fight was no longer about a shove or a threat. It was about unmasking the mechanisms that allowed it, exposing the hidden power, and ensuring accountability. Walter's reflection hardened into resolve. The officer had assumed untouchability. He had misjudged the persistence, the networks, and the strategy of someone unwilling to be erased. Every detail Walter had collected would serve as both shield and weapon. The city might protect its own, but knowledge had a power all its own, and Walter was armed. Walter Hayes understood that direct confrontation would be suicidal. The officer was embedded in the political hierarchy, untouchable through ordinary channels. Resistance demanded subtlety, alliances, and strategic pressure. He began building a network, carefully, methodically, without alerting the officer or his enablers. His first call was to a journalist he trusted, someone skilled in exposing misconduct without exposing sources prematurely. "There's a pattern here," Walter said, voice controlled, leaning over his kitchen table. Not just what happened in the parking lot, but a systemic abuse of authority, protected by political connections. The journalist asked questions, taking notes, probing for verification. Walter provided times, names, and a copy of the security footage. Next, he reached out to former military colleagues, men and women who understood discipline, observation, and patience. They offered advice on surveillance, documentation, and maintaining emotional composure under stress. Walter kept records of every interaction, meticulously logging dates, times, and content. Every conversation was a building block, every email a potential leverage point. Social media became a tool of quiet amplification. Walter documented procedural failures, sharing anonymized details of harassment and bureaucracy, highlighting patterns of systemic inequity. He avoided sensationalism. Every post was factual, measured, and legally sound. Slowly, a digital footprint formed, a map of authority, accountability, and witness testimony. Meanwhile, the officer escalated. Small acts, tailing Walter, appearing unexpectedly near his workplace, subtle insinuations, signaled awareness of the investigation. Walter noticed the tension in city offices, whispered caution from clerks, and wary glances from bystanders. Each action by the officer confirmed the reach of his authority and the importance of discretion. Walter's sister, a lawyer, helped navigate legal channels, ensuring that filings were precise, evidence verifiable, and interactions documented. Their discussions were rigorous, blending strategy with caution. Every move must be calculated, she reminded him. They rely on fear, procedure, and inertia. You weaponize documentation. Community allies emerged unexpectedly. Local advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and sympathetic officials provided guidance and support. Dialogue-driven meetings allowed Walter to map potential allies and assess threats. Every interaction was measured, strategic, an intricate dance of trust, caution, and influence. One evening, Walter sat reviewing the growing archive, videos, notes, emails, witness statements. The weight of months of observation and documentation pressed on him, but with the weight came clarity. The officer's power was real, but not absolute. Every documented harassment, every procedural obstruction, every coded threat became evidence. Every ally, witness, and journalist was a potential counterbalance. Walter's resolve hardened. He would not confront the officer directly, not yet. Public exposure, legal challenges, and strategic pressure were his weapons. Quiet resistance meant patience, persistence, and precise action. He understood the emotional cost, the psychological toll, but also the necessity of resilience. By the week's end, Walter had constructed a network of documentation, witnesses, and allies. The city's bureaucracy, previously a monolith of indifference, had become a map of leverage points. Every connection he discovered, every pattern he documented, chipped away at the officer's presumed invulnerability. The chapter closed with a single moment of tension. Walter noticed the officer observing him from a distance, a vague figure under the streetlights outside his apartment building. The officer's presence was a reminder of risk, a test of patience. Walter did not flinch. He had begun the quiet work of dismantling untouchable authority, and he would not be deterred. The fight had shifted. From a public shove in the parking lot to strategic, evidence-driven resistance, Walter had moved from reactive to proactive. The battle was no longer one of survival. It was one of leverage, accountability, and calculated exposure. The subtle tension that had defined Walter Hayes' quiet resistance began to crack under the officer's increasing scrutiny. He noticed at first in small ways, cars parked too long near his home, a shadow lingering across the street, the faint click of boots on wet pavement outside his workplace. Each sign was deliberate, a message wrapped in intimidation. The officer was asserting control, testing boundaries, and Walter understood that the escalation was both personal and institutional. Inside his apartment, Walter reviewed footage from security cameras he had installed after the initial parking lot incident. The officer's movements were precise, calculated, almost ritualistic. He lingered, observed, tested response times. This was not harassment out of impulse. It was methodical enforcement of power. Each moment of surveillance was a reminder of the officer's reach and the city's implicit complicity. Walter's sister, legal counsel, and confidant emphasized caution. "Every encounter has to be documented," she said, eyes scanning the notes on her laptop. "You need proof, patterns, corroboration. This is how you neutralize fear with evidence." Their conversation was practical, strategic, and unemotional, reflecting the necessity of disciplined resistance. At work, Walter sensed the same quiet pressure. Colleagues became hesitant around him, their conversations clipped, eyes flicking toward windows or hallways. The officer's influence extended beyond the street. It had penetrated offices, personal routines, even social interactions. Walter cataloged each subtle shift, misappointments, delayed communications, whispered warnings. Every action contributed to the invisible architecture of intimidation. Public interactions mirrored this tension. When Walter visited city offices, he noted clerks moving papers unnecessarily, prolonging processing times, or asking redundant questions. He recognized coded compliance, passive complicity, and fear disguised as bureaucratic procedure. The system responded to the officer's influence silently but powerfully. Despite the pressure, Walter advanced his strategy. He met discreetly with journalists, veteran colleagues, and civil rights advocates. Each conversation was precise, aiming to gather corroboration, evaluate risks, and expand the network of support. Dialogue carried weight, revealing unspoken patterns, cautious observations, and potential vulnerabilities in the officer's otherwise untouchable authority. Late one evening, Walter received an anonymous tip. A message arrived via secure email, containing documents indicating prior internal investigations where the officer had manipulated outcomes to protect political allies. Legal and procedural gaps were exploited, leaving no trace in public records. The information confirmed Walter's suspicion. The officer had institutional immunity reinforced by political connections. The tip also suggested vulnerabilities, patterns of evidence that could be exposed with careful strategy. Walter digested the information methodically. The emotional weight was significant, but it was harnessed, converted into analytical insight. He plotted next steps, how to gather further corroboration, document surveillance, and maintain personal safety while incrementally building pressure. He realized that patience was essential. A single misstep could escalate the situation into personal or legal peril. The officer's escalating actions culminated in a near confrontation outside a city council meeting. Walter, aware of the surveillance, maneuvered with deliberate caution, avoiding any opportunity for the officer to claim provocation. Each observation, each maneuver was catalogued, recorded, and analyzed. The psychological game was exacting, draining, yet Walter maintained control. By the end of the chapter, the stakes had crystallized. The officer's authority was vast, politically reinforced, and psychologically oppressive. Walter's resistance had shifted from passive documentation to strategic anticipation. Every encounter, every shadow, and every subtle act of intimidation became data, evidence to counter the system's abuse. Walter looked out his apartment window at the city lights reflecting off wet streets. He understood the cost: sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and the emotional strain of persistent threat. Yet he also recognized the necessity of calculated resistance. The officer had escalated. Walter would meet that escalation with strategy, preparation, and deliberate action. The chapter closed with a tense acknowledgement that a decisive confrontation, legal or public, was approaching, but timing, evidence, and allies would determine its outcome. Walter Hayes stepped into the courthouse lobby, the high ceilings and marble floors amplifying the quiet murmur of legal proceedings. He carried a thick folder of meticulously documented evidence: security footage, witness statements, email correspondences, and records of procedural obstructions. Every page, every timestamp, was a weapon in a battle he had prepared for months. The officer's political immunity was formidable, but the law, carefully wielded, could pierce even the most insulated authority. His legal team, composed of a seasoned civil rights attorney and a junior associate, outlined the strategy. We focus on systemic abuse, procedural violations, and documented harassment, the attorney said. We don't attack personality, we attack power structures and tangible violations. Walter absorbed every instruction, nodding. Patience, precision, and adherence to process were essential. This was no longer a personal confrontation. It was an institutional one. The courtroom was tense. The officer sat at the front, impeccably composed, uniform pressed, badge gleaming under fluorescent lights. His posture exuded confidence, the calm of someone accustomed to invulnerability. Walter, seated with his legal team, felt the weight of months of surveillance, documentation, and strategic planning settle onto his shoulders. Opening arguments emphasized fact over emotion. Walter's attorney presented a chronological account of harassment, the parking lot incident, the subsequent surveillance, intimidation outside work and home, and procedural stonewalling by city officials. Each piece of evidence was displayed succinctly, reinforcing patterns of abuse and systemic failure. The officer's political connections, once hidden, were woven into the narrative, showing the intersection of personal authority and structural protection. Witnesses were called: clerks who had noticed unusual delays, colleagues who observed the officer's subtle intimidation, and anonymous sources confirming prior internal investigations. Each dialogue-heavy testimony reinforced the narrative without sensationalism. The courtroom absorbed the testimony, the contrast between carefully documented patterns and the officer's polished composure creating tension that was almost tangible. Cross-examination revealed cracks. The officer, previously impenetrable in casual encounters, struggled with discrepancies in official reports and the clarity of video evidence. Questions highlighted selective memory, inconsistent statements, and the contrast between public claims and documented reality. Walter remained silent but elate, noting every reaction, every falter. Each subtle inconsistency eroded the officer's untouchable image. Outside the courtroom, the city buzzed with cautious attention. Journalists reported procedural details, carefully verifying every claim. Social media quietly circulated summaries, emphasizing documented abuse over sensational rhetoric. Walter's network of allies monitored the proceedings, offering support and analysis. Every post, every discussion, reinforced public awareness, extending accountability beyond the courtroom walls. As the trial progressed, Walter's focus narrowed to strategy. He anticipated delays, expected motions to dismiss, and prepared counter-arguments for procedural challenges. Dialogue with his attorney centered on preserving momentum, ensuring no misstep, and protecting witnesses from intimidation. The officer's political shield remained a factor, but transparency, evidence, and careful legal maneuvering began to chip away at its power. The courtroom climaxed during a key testimony. A former internal affairs officer provided detailed accounts of prior manipulations by the accused officer, corroborating patterns of preferential treatment and suppression of complaints. The evidence, combined with Walter's persistent documentation, created an irrefutable narrative. Authority had been abused, and political protection had shielded misconduct. Walter's emotional resilience was tested. Every moment in the courtroom, every exchange, carried tension, fear, and the weight of systemic injustice. Yet he remained composed, understanding that the legal process required discipline, not emotional reactivity. His military training, strategic patience, and prior documentation converged, allowing him to participate as both subject and strategist. The officer's composure faltered in private moments. Observers noted subtle signs of anxiety, clipped answers, avoidance of eye contact, and a defensive posture inconsistent with prior confidence. Dialogue, previously controlled and commanding, revealed strain when faced with the weight of documented accountability. By the end of the chapter, the legal confrontation had achieved significant progress. Walter's persistence and methodical strategy had transformed a personal harassment incident into a structural challenge, exposing patterns of abuse, political protection, and institutional failure. The officer remained in position, but cracks in his untouchability were visible, and the momentum of accountability was shifting. Walter exited the courthouse into a late afternoon drizzle. The rain mirrored the opening scene of the initial incident, but this time it felt different, not a signal of fear, but a reminder of the calculated, evidence-based journey he had undertaken. The legal battle was far from over, but each step now carried weight, leverage, and the potential for meaningful consequences. He understood that justice was both procedural and psychological. Small victories were cumulative, and patience, strategy, and persistence were the instruments through which systemic power could finally be challenged. The morning the expose appeared online, Walter Hayes sat at his kitchen table, coffee untouched, staring at the glowing screen. The headline was precise, factual, and unflinching. City officer abuses authority, ties to mayoral security revealed. The article laid out the documented harassment, surveillance patterns, and procedural obstruction Walter had endured, all corroborated with video, emails, and witness testimony. The public reaction was immediate. Social media lit up with commentary, discussion, and outrage. Citizens debated systemic abuse, the protection of political allies, and the inadequacy of oversight. Local news stations picked up the story, carefully navigating legal considerations but amplifying the pattern of misconduct. The officer, previously untouchable in the shadows of authority, now faced scrutiny under both public and institutional lenses. Walter fielded calls from journalists, colleagues, and community advocates. Each conversation was careful, measured, focused on clarifying facts and reinforcing documented patterns. He was no longer just a victim. He was a strategist, ensuring that every public mention strengthened the evidence chain while avoiding sensationalism. Dialogue carried the weight of both caution and authority, exposing systemic failure without descending into rhetoric. The officer responded to exposure predictably, attempting denials, claiming procedural compliance, and leveraging familiar political connections. But each assertion was countered by documented evidence, public awareness, and the growing network of allies Walter had cultivated. The once silent city offices now buzzed with quiet tension, employees unsure how to navigate the shifting balance of power. Community engagement intensified. Local civil rights organizations held forums, discussing accountability, procedural reform, and advocacy for victims of systemic abuse. Walter's documentation became a resource, guiding discussions and empowering citizens to recognize patterns of institutional oppression. Each dialogue-driven forum reinforced the stakes. Unchecked authority could no longer operate in isolation. Meanwhile, subtle pressure from the expose forced internal investigations. Supervisors and city officials, previously indifferent, were compelled to respond under public scrutiny. The officer's previously secure position became vulnerable, his reputation exposed to both colleagues and citizens. Even those loyal to him began reconsidering alliances, weighing professional risk against association with documented misconduct. Walter observed the unfolding consequences with tempered focus. The exposure did not erase the emotional toll or trauma he had endured, but it amplified leverage. Every detail, every recorded act, now had social, legal, and political resonance. The officer's authority, once hidden in bureaucratic shadows, was now illuminated, fragile under combined scrutiny. The chapter's climax occurred at a public city council meeting. Citizens, journalists, and advocacy groups gathered, demanding accountability. Questions directed at the officer were precise, evidence-based, and unflinching. He faltered in responses, contradictions appearing under pressure, and the council recorded the exchange for public documentation. The dialogue-driven confrontation crystallized a shift. Authority that once imposed fear was now subject to accountability. Walter remained in the background, observing rather than engaging. His strategy emphasized measured impact, exposure, corroboration, and strategic leverage. The public's attention, combined with systemic documentation, had transformed a single act of harassment into a broader revelation of structural failure. As the meeting concluded, Walter stepped outside into a drizzle reminiscent of the parking lot incident months earlier. The rain glistened on the streets, reflecting neon signs and wet asphalt. He allowed himself a brief recognition. The officer's power had been exposed, his untouchable status fractured. Yet the work was not complete. Systemic patterns persisted, and vigilance remained essential. Walter's reflection was deliberate, analytical. Public exposure had shifted momentum, empowered allies, and created accountability, but the emotional cost and strain on personal life endured. He understood the dual nature of the victory. Institutional scrutiny could weaken abusers, yet the scars of harassment and systemic injustice lingered. The chapter closed on a note of tense equilibrium. The officer's authority was compromised, the city was watching, and the public conversation had changed. Walter had turned documentation, patience, and strategic action into leverage, proving that even politically shielded power could be challenged. But the system itself remained in place, awaiting the next test of accountability. The consequences of public exposure rippled through the city bureaucracy like a shockwave. Walter Hayes watched as the officer, once untouchable, began to encounter resistance at every turn. Invitations to official events dwindled. Colleagues avoided direct contact, and whispers filled corridors where deference had once ruled. Authority, built on political proximity and fear, was fracturing under the weight of documented accountability. Legal proceedings compounded the pressure. Internal affairs reopened prior cases, now under the glare of public scrutiny. Testimony corroborated patterns of selective enforcement, intimidation, and obstruction. Each confirmed instance reinforced a perception that the officer had acted with impunity, shielded by a network of political allies. The courtroom and city offices became arenas where procedural norms, once protective, now amplified vulnerability. Walter observed the subtle unraveling with measured focus. The officer's demeanor shifted in private meetings. Clipped responses, avoidance of eye contact, and visible tension replaced the polished composure he once wielded as armor. Allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose conduct had become publicly and institutionally indefensible. Dialogue-driven exchanges, once tools of intimidation, now reveal fear and defensiveness. Public scrutiny extended beyond professional consequences. Community forums, citizen oversight committees, and media coverage highlighted patterns of abuse and systemic protection. The officer's reputation, carefully cultivated over years, suffered irreversible erosion. Strategic silence from those who had previously turned a blind eye magnified the effect, exposing the mechanisms of complicity and the fragility of power dependent on fear rather than accountability. Yet poetic justice was not instantaneous, and Walter remained acutely aware of the emotional cost. The months of harassment, surveillance, and procedural obstruction had left indelible scars. Sleep remained elusive, moments of anxiety surfaced unexpectedly, and trust required constant calibration. The victory was structural, societal, and systemic, but the personal aftermath demanded reflection, resilience, and ongoing vigilance. Walter's network of allies continued to support him, ensuring legal conclusions were solid and public narratives accurate. The officer faced internal disciplinary action, public censure, and diminished authority within the political hierarchy. No longer insulated by proximity to power, he became a cautionary example. Even carefully constructed shield could crumble under persistent, evidence-driven accountability. The culmination occurred during a city council session convened to address broader systemic reforms. The officer was present, visibly constrained by scrutiny and procedural oversight. Questions from council members and citizens exposed inconsistencies, highlighting patterns of selective enforcement, intimidation, and abuse. Dialogue was precise, evidence-backed, and unflinching. The officers' attempt to assert authority were met with documentation and collective awareness, power shifting from individual control to systemic checks. Walter, observing from the gallery, noted the stark contrast of his initial encounter months prior. Where fear and humiliation had once dominated, now transparency, strategy, and persistence dictated outcomes. His patience, meticulous documentation, and alliances had transformed personal victimization into public accountability. Yet he also acknowledged a deeper truth. Systemic structures required vigilance, and one victory did not erase institutional patterns. The chapter closed on the symbolic finality of justice tempered by realism. The officer's authority had collapsed, both publicly and institutionally, yet the emotional cost of Walter endured. He understood the duality. Societal change had been achieved, but personal recovery required time, reflection, and continued resilience. In the fractured city landscape, Walter's experience became both a guide and a warning, a testament to the power of persistence, evidence, and strategy against entrenched abuse. Word count, 850. The city streets were quiet that morning, rain-slicked and reflective, echoing the calm that followed months of tension and confrontation. Walter Hayes navigated them deliberately, aware of the subtle shifts around him. The officer who had once wielded intimidation with impunity was no longer untouchable. Internal investigations had concluded, the council had instituted reforms, and public exposure had rendered the officer professionally diminished. Yet the city remained a place of systemic tension, its structures unchanged at root, awaiting the next test of accountability. Walter's daily routine resumed with measured vigilance. Mornings were spent reviewing civic updates, legal bulletins, and community notifications. Afternoons involved mentoring young veterans and engaging with advocacy groups, using his experience to educate others about systemic abuse, procedural navigation, and strategic resistance. Each dialogue was deliberate, evidence-backed, and aimed at empowering those who might otherwise be silenced or intimidated. Personal recovery required attention. Walter maintained therapy sessions to process trauma, acknowledging the psychological weight of harassment, surveillance, and institutional obstruction. Emotional resilience was cultivated through reflection, disciplined routines, and conversations with trusted allies. The scars of months of intimidation remained, but they were tempered by agency, clarity, and a sense of purpose forged in adversity. Community engagement deepened. Walter collaborated with civil rights organizations to establish channels for documenting abuse, supporting victims, and fostering transparency within municipal structures. Dialogue-driven forums became educational platforms, allowing citizens to understand the mechanisms that had shielded the officer and to develop strategies for accountability in future cases. The city began to see the impact of combined documentation, strategy, and collective awareness. Walter's reflection extended to the broader societal implications. The officer's downfall had been a demonstration of leverage, evidence, and strategic persistence against entrenched power, but it had not dismantled systemic patterns. Policy reforms were incremental, cultural shift gradual. Each victory required ongoing vigilance, legal insight, and community engagement to ensure that individual accountability translated into structural change. Friends and family, previously tense and cautious around Walter's engagement with city politics, now observed his efforts with a blend of respect and relief. His sister continued to provide legal guidance, helping to codify lessons learned into frameworks that could assist others facing harassment or institutional indifference. Each interaction reinforced the importance of networks, documentation, and strategic patience in achieving justice. By mid-afternoon, Walter walked through a familiar park, observing children, commuters, and local vendors. The city had resumed its rhythm, indifferent in some ways, but perceptive in others. He noted subtle signs of change, officers acting with greater procedural caution, municipal staff attentive to documentation, and community members more willing to engage in civic oversight. These small indicators were tangible evidence that persistent strategy and public accountability could influence behavior, even within entrenched systems. The chapter concluded with a reflection on duality, victory tempered by cost. The officer faced professional and public consequences. Structural awareness and civic vigilance had been amplified. Yet Walter carried the personal consequences of months of harassment, stress, and confrontation. Emotional scars persisted alongside societal progress. As the sun dipped behind city buildings, casting long shadows over wet asphalt, Walter paused at a street corner, breathing deeply. He recognized that the battle against systemic abuse was ongoing, that vigilance, strategy, and collective engagement were essential, and that personal resilience was as critical as public accountability. The fight had yielded justice, but it had also left an imprint, a testament to both the cost of standing against abuse and the possibility of meaningful change when courage, evidence, and strategic action converge.